Mining community, welcome back to another episode of the Dig Deep the Mining podcast. And today's guest is Richard Williams, who's the CEO of Cornish Metals, who are Associate Company of Osisko and building a portfolio of strategic metal assets in the UK and North America. Their near-term strategy is to focus on exploration of near-surface high-grade copper and tin mineralization at the United Downs project in Cornwall, UK. Rich is a professional geologist who has over 30 years of experience in the mining and mineral exploration sector, principally in South Africa or Southern Africa and South and Central America. And he's here today to talk about Cornish Metals and what is happening in Cornwall in the UK. So that's welcome Richard to the podcast. How you doing, Richard?
Very good, Rob. Thanks for having me on. It's a pleasure.
Yeah, and I appreciate your time. I know you're over from Canada in the UK, attending a number of conferences. So yeah, really appreciate you taking the time out to do this podcast. So as we always start these podcasts off, I just wondered if you can give us a background about yourself so the audience knows you, a little bit about your career. Obviously, like I said, you've been in the industry for 30 years. So yeah, I'll hand it over to you to tell us a little bit about yourself.
Okay, well, thanks. I think you could probably tell from my accent that I'm not from Canada. From Wales originally. Grew up in a coal mining town in South Wales. Graduated in the late 80s. Went, like many geologists at the time, ended up in South Africa working on the deep gold mines. Was there through the late 80s, early 90s. Then migrated across to Canada. Did a master's degree in mineral exploration. And that then led on to working in South America for 4.5 years in the Guyana Shield, Suriname, Guyana, Venezuela, before moving up to Vancouver in '98. Followed that up with a couple of years exploration down in Mexico, some work in Sardinia. And then, as you touched on, spent a lot of time between 2004 and recently working in Namibia and Tanzania, copper and gold exploration. And in around about 2015, some of the guys that I know in the Osisko group asked if I'd be interested in looking at building a tin company. And like probably a lot of people at the time, I wasn't fully up to speed with the importance of tin to the electronics world. And after digging a bit deeper, I realized that there was a fascinating opportunity looming on the horizon. And so I joined what was then called Strongbow Exploration. And it was a listed company, listed in Canada. And the whole objective was to look for tin projects in a good jurisdiction, preferably something that had a mining history. And lo and behold, we ended up acquiring projects in Cornwall. And so we always felt that the perfect fit for the company would be to get a listing here in the UK, and we succeeded with that in February this year, and now we're pushing forward, as you said, with the exploration program at United Downs, and also looking at ways where we can advance the iconic South Crofty tin mine in Cornwall.
Great. So yeah, just wondering if you can tell us about obviously Cornish Metals. I wonder if you can tell us about the company, and then we can talk about Cornwall afterwards.
Sure. Well, when we started looking at tin projects, what I realized fairly quickly was that there really weren't many good quality tin projects available for acquisition, certainly under the mandate that we were looking for, which was really a good jurisdiction. I think what was startling was that there's really no primary tin mine production in Europe. There's none at all in North America. The US has classed tin as a strategic mineral, and fairly quickly came to realize that the bulk of tin consumption goes into electronics. And so my initial thought was, there's a strategic angle here where a tin producer could, just like you see today in the car world, these alliances with end users, where end users are looking for specific supplies of different metals to meet their objectives, and the whole growing ESG kind of things. When we came across the Cornish assets, the company that had them had moved the projects into administration. Some of your viewers might remember that probably between 2011, 2012, really up until last year, we were in quite a prolonged bear market for resource commodities, base metals in particular. And so South Crofty, the company that had it previously, had funded the project to the point where they'd secured a new mine permit, they'd secured planning permission to build a new process plant, but the market wasn't there to fund it any further. So when we came along, we had almost a fully permitted project that needed that next step. And, you know, again, as the resource kind of world goes, it's a very cyclic kind of sector in the economy. And here we are today with tin prices at record highs and an opportunity to move some of these projects forward. So we ended up acquiring the Cornish assets from administration in 2016. We published an initial resource on the South Crofty tin project, and it is probably the highest grade, or is the highest grade tin project in the world right now that's not in production. So, you know, we've seen this whole transition towards electrifying the economy, looking at renewable power sources, power storage, the Internet of Things, the growth of all of these things, and tin is essential to all of these parts of the economy. So it's a real opportunity for Cornwall to get back on the map of mining, and specifically supplying some of the UK or Europe's needs from a tin and copper perspective.
Yeah. Before we talk about Cornwall, obviously you mentioned tin is a sort of important and strategic metal. I just wonder if you can tell us a little bit more about, obviously, and what you've discovered over the last sort of 5 years, what you know more about, obviously what you know about tin, and how strategic is it?
Yeah, no, for sure. You know, up until, you know, the mid 1980s, there was a group known as the International Tin Council that really kind of managed the tin market. I guess almost a cartel, for want of a better term. And then there was the discovery of new tin deposits in Brazil and Malaysia that came onto the market, and the Tin Council basically went bankrupt. And as a result, the tin price crashed in 1985. And that led to the closure of pretty much all of the hard rock tin mines around the world. At that time, the US also had a strategic stockpile of tin. And I guess they looked at that and said, well, it's not really strategic anymore. We've got all of this tin supply coming onto the market. And to compound the oversupply issues, the US sold off their stockpile that they had as well. The big change for tin was about 20 years ago, where the EU passed legislation outlawing the use of lead solder because of its toxic nature. And the only suitable replacement was tin. Now, up until, I would say 2001, 2002, the annual tin market was around 200,000 tons per year of tin. And as a result of this change towards using tin in solder, you saw the consumption of tin jump dramatically to about today's levels, around 360, 370,000 tons of tin per year. So I think that's helped over the last 20 years to kind of take up all of that excess supply, excess product that was in the market. And today, about 50% of all the tin consumed goes into solder in electronics. So anything that's got electric circuitry, a circuit board, your laptop, your iPhone, your dishwasher, microwave oven, your TV, everything's got tin in it. And what you're seeing now is, you know, almost a combination of things. One is obviously the push to address climate change and reduce carbon footprint, and, you know, look at how we can do that. And you couple that with this whole drive towards electrification of the economy, and it's all benefiting tin consumption. And it's become very much a discussion point within governments, is to identify what resources you've got domestically which can help in this drive towards the electrification and carbon footprint reduction. And Cornwall is blessed with being, one of these regional world-class mineral districts that had a long history of copper and tin mining. So that's where the opportunity lies for tin going forward and for Cornwall.
Yeah, I was going to go on to my next question. Is sort of the Cornwall area, is that the mecca for tin, or is there other sort of countries around the world that there is sort of a tin in abundance?
Yeah, that's a really interesting point, because when you look at where tin production, certainly mined tin production, comes from today, 75% of the mine production comes from three countries: China, Myanmar, and Indonesia. There's production from Tasmania. There's a famous mine there called Renison, which is similar to some of the Cornish mines. It's high grade, narrow, underground. So you've got a tin belt in Tasmania. There's also a region in Peru. There's a mine called San Rafael, which has been a big producer over the last 20, 30 years. And then more recently, there's a company called Alpha Min that just put the Bissy tin project in DRC into production. That's incredibly high grade. It's a fantastic deposit. Obviously a bit of a challenging location, but the guys have done an amazing job building the mine and putting that into production. But I think Cornwall has been, to a large degree until recently, almost forgotten about as a source for tin. And everything that we've looked at suggests that there's enormous potential to put some of these projects back into production and help kind of secure the supply certainly into Europe and maybe North America.
So let's talk about Cornwall. What actually initially attracted you to the prospect of sort of mining in Cornwall? And I wonder if you can give us an overview of, I suppose, tin in the Cornwall area.
Yeah. If I'm honest, when the opportunity first came across the desk, my initial thought was Cornwall. It's not your regular destination for mining investment these days. But I came across and was really blown away by the quality of the asset, certainly at South Crofty, and the scale of the deposit. There's a 3D model that we use. I think we're going to try and put it onto the website, which shows the extent of the underground workings in what's known as the Central Mining District of Cornwall, which underlies the South Crofty mine, extends across to United Downs, where we're exploring right now. And it really gives you a flavour for the amount of underground workings that exist down there. There's not really much evidence on surface for the scale of the operations, apart from some of the old kind of engine houses that have been preserved over time. More importantly, from South Crofty's perspective, one of the biggest aspects, I think, anywhere in the world today to put in a new project into production is so-called permit risk. And we were the beneficiaries of the previous guys who were investing in the project, where they'd secured a new mine permit, which is valid for another 50 years. They got that granted in 2013. In 2011, planning permission was granted to build a process plant. So when we looked at the project, it was 2/3 of the way there from a permitting perspective. So I think the aspects that we wanted to feel comfortable with was, could we get the environmental permit to dewater the mine, because it is flooded today. And we worked with the Environment Agency to come up with a plan that was beneficial to the environment, but also would help push South Crofty towards production. We had that permit granted in 2017. And more importantly, I think the biggest aspect that affects any project today, certainly in an urban environment, is social license or community support. And South Crofty, again, is very iconic mine in the region. There's a very strong association between the local community and South Crofty itself. And, we've just had overwhelming support from the local community, from local council right up to Cornwall Council to, obviously work to best practices, but the opportunity to put this mine back into production would provide enormous economic boost to the towns of Camborne, Poole, Redruth. It is an area that suffers from unemployment, underemployment. It's not part of that whole Cornish tourism scene. So that's where we see the opportunity, potentially create 275 jobs directly at the mine site, and maybe another 750 to 1,000 jobs on the indirectly on the supply chain side. So, everything ticks the boxes. And another aspect to it is it's an underground mine, so it's got a very small surface footprint, and would probably be the only mine in the world where we can put 100% of the tailings back underground, because you've got all of these void spaces from historic mining activity that we can use as the depositories for the tailings.
No, and that's good to hear. You mentioned obviously that you're working that the actual community are on your side, and obviously working hand in hand with, I suppose, local businesses in the area. I know you guys have got a strong relationship with the Campbell School mines. How have they helped along with the process?
Just the fact that Camborne School of Mines, I think, is internationally regarded as one of the best mining schools. It's produced some of the best mining engineers, mine geologists, surveyors, mineral processors. Means that part of Cornwall, or Cornwall in general, has got a wealth of people down there who have got incredible technical expertise in the mining industry. A lot of those people ply their trades all around the world today, but many of them still live in Cornwall. So you've got that aspect. People often look at the availability of skilled labor to try and get a project going again, and it certainly exists at the higher levels. From Camborne School of Mines perspective, we see a great opportunity here for us to work with them. We've had a number of students come down and do research projects at South Crofty. We regularly have classes come to the mine site to do various practical classes and gain experience in an underground environment. So, I think it's trying to build up that longer term association where we can work together to produce the next generation of people to work in the mining industry. But obviously it's far removed from the old ways of operating. You're looking at new technologies and applying them underground at somewhere like South Crofty.
Yeah. You recently announced the results from the ongoing drilling program at United Downs, obviously copper and tin project, which has demonstrated high grades, including silver. I just wonder if you can tell us a little bit more about that.
Yeah, it's a fascinating area. It's only about 8 kilometers as the crow flies to the east of South Crofty, so it's really all part of almost a continuous mineralized district. When we looked at the project just over a year or so ago, Owen Mylop, who's our chief operating officer, he'd identified it as an area with very high prospectivity from an exploration perspective. And the reason for that is you've got a cluster of historic mines. 2 of them, one was called United Mines, another was called Consolidated Mines, were very high grade underground copper producers through the 1700s, right up until 1860, 1870. The recorded average grades from those mines was in excess of 7% copper, which resulted in the area being called the richest square mile on earth at the time. It generated incredible wealth for the region. Those mines ended up closing in the 1860s, 1870, when there was new copper projects discovered in the Americas, larger, lower cost operations, which again led to a drop in the copper price at the time. It's not to say that those mines actually mined everything out. We've actually drilled some holes beneath United Mine and got some very high grade copper mineralization. So we know it extends to depth. And then a little bit further east, from United Mine, there was a mine called Mount Wellington, which operated in the late 60s and up until about 1977. That was a tin, zinc, copper, silver producer. And then immediately on trend from that to the east was another mine called Wheel Jane, which some of your viewers may remember. It was in operation until 1991. It was owned by Rio Tinto back in the day, and that was also a tin, zinc, copper, silver producer. So you've clearly got a geological environment that's had a lot of metal emplaced into it. And in the 1980s, prior to the tin price collapse, Rio Tinto had identified an area between United Mine and Consolidated Mines as being prospective. And so they'd started developing some underground tunnels and a decline to explore that area. And then the tin price collapsed, and that was the end of their exploration. And that was really the last exploration that took place in Cornwall. And last year, there was a drill hole drilled by our partner, Cornish Lithium, who's looking for lithium in brine potential throughout Cornwall. And that drill hole was right between the United Mine and Consolidated Mines, and they discovered, as you said, some high-grade copper mineralization. I think the intercept was around 14.5 meters at 8.5% copper. So even though it was exceptionally high grade in comparison to other projects around the world, it's certainly similar grade to what was being mined historically at United and Consolidated Mines. So it wasn't really an outlier in that perspective. We then used, one of the things we've always talked about is the exploration potential in Cornwall. It's one of the most heavily mined regions in the world, but probably one of the least explored regions. And it's and the reasons for that is that most of the mining took place a long time ago, and the way the operators would conduct business back in those days was they'd find an outcrop in vein, they'd sink a shaft on it, and then they'd mine laterally away from that, and they would never mine any waste. They'd never go looking for another vein. So even though you've got all these big mines everywhere, there's a lot of scope to find additional mineralization between some of those old operations, but also along trend from them. And in fact, when you look at some of the complexities of working in Cornwall is the way the mineral rights work. So the mineral right boundaries would reflect land holdings on surface. And so if you owned a chunk of land, you'd own the mineral rights beneath that land. And very often you might mine on your mineral rights and reach your property boundary, and that would be the end of the mine. Maybe the next mineral right owner didn't want to mine. So you've got the extension in those directions, which are still open for exploration. So it's a fascinating area. We've now announced drill results from 8 holes at United Downs. And what we're seeing is evidence for a number of kind of pulses of mineralization. Some of the intercepts are very high grade tin only. Some have copper plus tin plus silver. Others have zinc plus silver. So, the next step for us is to try and figure out how all this fits together, but it's certainly an area with some very high grades and we think a lot of potential.
Great to hear. Your South Crofty tin mine is well known and obviously locally within the mining sector. What are your current plans with the project? Obviously, particularly with the booming tin price.
Yeah. Well, as I touched on earlier, it is the highest grade tin resource currently not in production in the world. We published a new resource this year, which outlined different classifications, around 2 million tons indicated and around 2 million tons inferred. Both categories are around 1.6% tin. What does that mean? Well, 1% is 22 pounds. So 1.6% would be about 33, 34 pounds of tin for every ton of that rock. And today you're looking at the tin price around $17 per pound. So 30 odd pounds, that, a ton of that rock would be worth something in the order of 550 to 580 US dollars per ton. That's very high grade. And, that's eminently viable from an underground mining perspective. What we are facing today is that the mine is flooded. When the mine closed in 1998, the pumps were turned off. which is why we then had to work with the Environment Agency to show that we could extract the water, treat the water and clean it to a level that's acceptable to the Environment Agency. And what that does, it actually cleans up the environment of the Red River, which is currently receiving contaminated mine water from it. So the next steps in the project there are is to work through that whole dewatering aspect of the mine. We think if we can raise the funding at some point to do that, then certainly we could see the timeline to get into production over the next few years would really tie in with what the International Tin Association is now, what they've been predicting for the last several years is a technology super cycle, where we get into this period where new technologies are coming on stream faster and faster. And a lot of these things are related to computing or renewable power or power storage, electric vehicles, enhancement of the current grid, or the Internet of Things, for one, and that's one of the terms used today. And all of these things need tin. So I think you're going to see growing demand for tin going forward. But the other side of the equation there is that because the tin price crashed in 1985, we've gone through a period of 30 years with underinvestment, looking for new tin opportunities. So yeah, that's why we think so highly of South Crofty.
How's the landscape of mining in Cornwall changed with the move towards carbon neutrality?
Well, Cornwall is a very interesting area. There's lots of renewable power generation going on there right now, wind farms, solar panel fields, a lot of research going into offshore floating wind generating platforms. So there is a lot of power being generated. You've also got this, I guess, these ambitions within the UK to have a domestic battery manufacturing sector, electric vehicle sector. And all of these things play into, this modern economy that we're all aspiring for, which is a reduction in carbon footprints. When you look at mining in Cornwall, the opportunity that we have at South Crofty is to capitalize on some of those kind of renewable power sources, where that would offset what traditional uses would have been, which is coal-fired power, I guess, for the projects. On the mine itself, the water that's in the mine is fairly warm. So when we extract the water, we see an opportunity to extract that heat as well and use that heat for heating of the offices and local buildings nearby the project. So there's a number of things that we're looking at that would be beneficial to, the push towards carbon neutrality. But more importantly, I think a lot of end users are looking at where materials are coming from. And, you've got the rise in ESG, environment, social governance aspects from not only from an investment perspective, but I think from an end user's perspective. And, you look at things like your iPhone or whatever phone you use, whatever manufacturer it is. I think there's a demand from end users to make sure that the products within those electronic appliances are sourced responsibly. And, just using tin as an example, in many parts of the world, tin might be seen as funding conflict or, resulting in large-scale environmental destruction. As an example, in Indonesia, much of the tin is produced from offshore dredging operations, and it's having a big impact on reef systems and fishing environments. And, I think that's where we see an opportunity here. You can responsibly mine in an environment that is supportive of the operation. You can have a positive impact on the local environment, and you can supply tin to end users, groups like a Google or an Apple or a Panasonic, that is really looking to ensure that all of the materials they use are responsibly sourced.
How important is it to domestically supply the critical minerals essential for the green transition, particularly from obviously Cornwall, a place with rich history in mining?
Well, from my perspective, it's essential. again, tin is fundamental, ubiquitous to anything electronic. So, if we want to grow this electric economy, you're going to need tin. So the options faced with you are: do you want to import your tin from Asia with a larger footprint, or do you want to produce it here? That's the opportunity from a tin perspective. The other thing that you're looking at in Cornwall now is a recognition that you've got this regional geological environment that has potential for other metals. So, lithium has got onto the radar, copper potential, obviously the silver that we've seen down in Cornwall. So now I think there's a growing recognition, which has expanded from Cornwall. A couple of years ago, Cornwall was kind of recognized as a high potential opportunity region by Westminster for the resource potential because of the history of mining there. And I think there's a growing recognition as well in Westminster now of the identifying what are metals that can be sourced domestically, what is critical to the economy. And if you want these kind of next generation battery manufacturing centers, car manufacturing, if you want to compete with other countries throughout Europe that are already trying to put this infrastructure into place, you don't have to go any further than Cornwall. You've got some of the resources there that can supply that growth.
I've got two more questions. First one's around Cornwall. Obviously, what would you say the outlook is for mining within the region over the next 20, 30, 40 years? You've mentioned, obviously, there's copper there, apart from obviously tin, there's copper there, there's silver there. The likes of Rio Tinto, as you mentioned, obviously many years ago, was involved there. How do you see mining in Cornwall over the next 20, 30, 40 years? How do you see it developing? And I know you haven't got a crystal ball either.
Yeah. Look, I think the fact that we've already got a permitted project tells you that there is support within, there's a mechanism in place where if you do the right things, you're going to get a project permitted and you can put it into production. I think it's essential to work with the local community so that the community is fully on board with what you're doing, why you're doing it, when you're doing it, how long it's going to take. I think it's important not to have to overpromise on the time frame and when things are going to happen. But there's been so many advances, in mining technology, extractive technology, where we benefit again at South Crofty, for example, is that you've got this enormous extent of underground working, so we can put all of the waste products, the tailings, back underground. So the visual impact on surface is minimal. It's confined to the process plant that we would have and the head frame for the shaft. I think the other thing that we add is, it's the diversification of the economy, which is currently, heavily weighted towards tourism. And, as through the COVID period here, we've seen a lot of people stay within the UK. You haven't been able to travel internationally. So a lot of people have been going down to Cornwall and enjoying the tourist attractions and the beaches it has to offer. But at the same time, tourism doesn't pay a lot of people high wages. What we bring to the table is the ability to train the next generation of the mining community in high quality, high paying jobs, highly skilled, well-trained people who can then apply that training elsewhere if need be. But it brings in certainly an industrial sector that pays well and would have a positive impact on Camborne, Poole, Redruth, and the regional economy as a whole. And I've always said, once you can get one project moving forward, it would attract additional investment, and we're already seeing that. There was a conference held in Falmouth recently, and we had groups Cornish Lithium, British Lithium, Cornwall Resources, Cornish Tin, Imerys, who have been there for a number of years mining the China clays. So I think people are seeing that you can work within the framework of the existing laws, and you can get permitted, you can get community support. And the attraction, certainly at Cornwall Council level, is the jobs that it would create, because it would provide a meaningful boost and some diversification to the economy.
And lastly, what's the outlook for Cornish Metals over the next sort of 12 to 18 months?
Well, I think I would say the outlook, probably better to look at where tin price and where the tin world is going. We've just received a monthly update from the International Tin Association, and this is an organization that kind of captures the full range of participants within the tin world, all the way from explorers, developers like ourselves, through mining companies, smelting companies, metals traders, end users, research and development. And it's apparent that we're going through this period of growth in demand. There was a very interesting graph published 2 or 3 years ago by Rio Tinto, which looked at new technologies such as robotics, computing, electric vehicles, again, power generation, power storage, which metals were used in those applications and which metals would be most impacted by growth in those technologies. And tin came top of the list. So, if there's an opportunity here for Cornish Metals to participate in that growth, and you're looking at, probably a 5 to 10 year, maybe longer, resource cycle. If we can get South Crofty going, we should be in production within 4 to 5 years, and participate in that. And then, we'd be a contributor to Europe's needs, North America's needs from a tin perspective. So I'm very positive about the future for the company. I think we've got a fantastic project. It's quite different from a lot of other greenfields projects that have not been mines in the past. South Crofty started, the earliest production records in South Crofty were back in 1592. And between 1592 and around 1900, 1905, it was principally a series of copper mines, which were mined in the top 2 to 250, 300 meters depth. And then in 1905, it transitioned to a tin mine, and there was a shaft sunk through the middle of all these old copper mines, which found a very large tin deposit beneath the old copper mines. And so it's a fascinating geological study, but when we look at it, we see enormous potential for the resource to grow and for South Crofty to be a mine for many years to come.
Richard, really appreciate your time in doing this podcast, and obviously explaining about obviously Cornish Metals, but also the prospects that we can see within the area of Cornwall. Obviously, it's had a rich history in the past, and hopefully we, as a mining industry, will hopefully rejuvenate the mining in that area, because, like I said, it obviously has a rich history, and as you demonstrated, there is a lot of obviously commodities, not just obviously tin, obviously silver, copper, as you explained. If our audience wants to sort of reach out to you, if they have any questions, how can they go about doing that? Are you across any social media platforms?
Yeah, we've got a Twitter page, a Facebook page. We've got a website, obviously, with an email address. If anybody's got any questions, they always get either answered by the team we've got, and if it becomes something very technical, there's Owen or myself that can answer the questions. So more than happy, if anybody's interested, just get in touch.
Yeah, and we can include those in the show notes accompanying this as well. So for easy access. So, like I said, Richard, really appreciate your time. Wish you well with the project. Certainly be following it closely, especially here in the UK. And obviously, this podcast goes out around the world. So, appreciate all our listeners if you can obviously follow the UK mining industry. I mean, I suppose a lot of people globally doesn't recognise UK has a mining industry as such, but you've demonstrated there is a lot of potential here. So appreciate the audience for listening. Appreciate again if you can share and like this episode amongst people within the industry, and show people around the world that UK does have a mining industry. So like I said, really appreciate your time, Richard. and we'll be following your story over the coming years. And until next time, happy mining.